"You are blocking my view of the digital whiteboard, Mitchell," Donald Blake said, without looking up from his sleek leather-bound tablet, mine scooting over to the window, or better yet, grabbing us some fresh coffees. "This strategic alignment phase does not really concern your operational tier anyway." I was standing near the end of the mahogany conference table, holding a stack of quarterly logistics audit summaries I had prepared over 48 painstaking hours. The whiteboard was behind me, but basic professional courtesy had long since become a distant memory in Donald Blake's corporate domain. Donald was the chief financial officer brought in 24 months ago by an aggressive private equity group after our original founding chief executive stepped down due to failing health. In Donald's eyes, anyone who spent more time managing physical supply chains than playing golf at the country club was an unnecessary overhead expense. I clenched my jaw, took a slow breath, and shuffled back toward the far corner of the ninth-floor glass boardroom like an uninvited guest. I watched silently as the afternoon presentation rolled forward without me. "Anyway," Donald continued, swiping to the next slide with all the theatrical flair of a man who believed a 3-month online executive certificate made him a master strategist. "With the board of directors fully behind us and legal sign-off virtually assured, we are primed to finalize the deal. Our partners at Vanguard Logistics are ready to drop a full $250 million to acquire Ardent Systems in its entirety. And the best part? They love our new corporate organizational chart. I explicitly informed their acquisition committee that Mitchell Carver's 1% stake is just a cute little souvenir from the early startup days. Adorable, but completely irrelevant to governance." A ripple of light laughter echoed through the air-conditioned room. My face remained entirely motionless. Not when Donald uttered the word souvenir with that slick, patronizing smirk. Not when he clicked past the operational financial projections I had personally built from the ground up across 12 grueling years. And certainly not when Trevor Higgins, my former junior logistics analyst, whom I had mentored for 5 years before he maneuvered his way into becoming the vice president of operations, leaned back in his leather chair and offered a pitying smirk. "Do not stress out too much, Mitchell," Trevor whispered under his breath so only I could hear. "If the transition goes smoothly, the board might still clear a small appreciation bonus for your legacy service." I was 54 years old, not ancient, and certainly not stupid. If anyone ever needed a masterclass in watching their life work erased in real time, I highly recommended sitting in a boardroom while 30-something corporate raiders treated a co-founder like an overpaid houseplant. When I co-founded Ardent Systems 12 years ago, we were just 4 people operating out of a damp rental office with a leaky roof and folding card tables. I built our entire global distribution infrastructure from scratch, stitching together vendor networks by hand, negotiating carrier rates in dusty freight terminals, and sleeping on airport benches between audits. When equity splits were distributed during our initial angel funding round, the other founders took large chunks of common stock. I requested exactly 1%, but I did not ask for 1% out of modesty or passivity. I asked for 1% because I wanted a very specific kind of equity. I did not want diluted phantom shares or non-voting incentive stock that possessed all the real legal weight of a carnival ticket. I demanded active, voting equity locked directly into the foundational corporate charter with unbreakable legal teeth. My personal attorney at the time, a seasoned corporate legal veteran named Frank Callahan, helped draft the clause directly into our original charter documents under Delaware corporate statutes. The protective provisions were buried beneath layers of boilerplate definitions, yet their legal authority was absolute. And yet, here we were 12 years later. Donald Blake had never bothered to read the company's foundational filings. To him, I was just a lingering middle-aged manager with a faded laptop and a knack for process documentation. I was not viewed as a threat worth investigating. By the time the 2-hour merger briefing concluded, my name had not been mentioned a single time regarding executive continuity or organizational transition. The only acknowledgement I received was when an administrative assistant passed out boxed gourmet lunches, and Trevor asked if I preferred the vegetarian wrap because I looked like someone trying to cut down on cholesterol. That evening, I drove home in complete silence. I walked down to my basement study, unlocked the heavy steel fireproof safe in the corner, and pulled out a worn manila folder labeled Founding Agreements. Inside lay our original charter documents, early investor meeting notes, and a hard copy of our foundational charter, complete with a tiny faint coffee ring near the signature page, from a late-night drafting session 12 years ago. My trembling fingers flipped through the crisp pages until I reached Section 8.3. Section 8.3. Any material change of control event, including but not limited to mergers, acquisitions, asset buyouts, or majority equity restructurings, requires the unanimous affirmative written consent of all original signatories holding active voting equity, regardless of current executive title or employment status. I read the paragraph 3 times. Then I retrieved a yellow highlighter and marked the text twice. Donald Blake thought my 1% was a souvenir. He was about to discover it was a detonator. By 8 o'clock on Monday morning, my digital work calendar had gone almost completely dark. Every recurring operational check-in, vendor review, and weekly inventory audit meeting I had led for 7 consecutive years had been deleted without warning. My calendar grid, once packed with blue blocks of active management, was now a barren white desert. At 10:14 that morning, an automated email notification arrived from Human Resources. The subject line read, "Revised Strategic Role Alignment." Exciting next chapter. The email body was a masterwork of corporate jargon and thinly veiled exile. In light of evolving strategic priorities surrounding the pending transaction with Vanguard Logistics, your role is officially transitioning to Special Projects Advisor under the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. While this transitional alignment will not include direct reporting staff or operational budget oversight, leadership is confident your deep institutional memory will offer immense value. Please reply to this message confirming your ongoing gratitude and alignment with executive vision. Ongoing gratitude. I stared at the screen for a long moment. They were offering me the polite corporate equivalent of solitary confinement, stripping away my team, revoking my administrative server privileges, and graying out my access to proprietary logistics databases. When I attempted to log into our internal network to review current vendor compliance files, an error message popped up instantly. Access denied, user scope restricted. The only shared folder I could still open was labeled Standard Employee Onboarding Guidelines. Later that afternoon, I encountered Donald Blake near the 9th floor espresso machine. He was holding court with Trevor Higgins and 2 young investment analysts clad in tailored blue suits. When Donald spotted me walking down the corridor with my notebook, he flashed an overly dramatic fake smile. "Mitchell, settling nicely into your new special projects niche?" he called out, making sure his voice carried down the entire hallway. "Do not feel down, my friend. Special projects is where all the real magic happens. Steve Jobs once worked on special projects, or maybe it was a consulting firm. Either way, fantastic vibe, right?" I offered a polite nod, kept my mouth shut, and walked straight out of the building. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the quiet office of Frank Callahan. Frank sat behind a massive oak desk covered with stacked legal briefs, framed certificates from 40 years of corporate law practice, and a glass bowl filled with old-fashioned hard candies. He put on his reading glasses, took the original charter document from my hands, and spent 10 minutes reading Section 8.3 in complete silence. Finally, Frank let out a low whistle and leaned back in his leather swivel chair. "Well, Mitchell," he said, tapping his finger against the highlighted paragraph, "Donald Blake and his private equity friends have built a giant glass castle on top of a legal sinkhole. They assumed your equity was standard diluted non-voting stock from subsequent funding rounds. But according to this document, your 1% active voting equity was never amended, surrendered, or reclassified. So it is still legally binding?" I asked, my voice steady. "It is absolute," Frank replied firmly. "Under Delaware corporate statutes, a charter provision requiring unanimous consent for a change of control cannot be bypassed by board resolution, executive realignment, or majority vote unless every single voting signatory executes a written waiver. Have you signed any equity waivers or title releases in the last 5 years?" "Not a single sheet of paper," I answered. Frank chuckled softly. folding his hands over his stomach. Then you possess absolute veto authority over a $250 million transaction. If they try to execute this merger without your express written approval, the entire deal is legally void, and Vanguard Logistics could face catastrophic title invalidity upon closing. Over the next 2 hours, Frank and I mapped out our strategic blueprint. We decided not to issue an immediate threat or file an early injunction. If we revealed our hand too early, Donald's high-priced corporate attorneys would attempt to pressure me into signing an emergency waiver or hunt for procedural technicalities to bypass the charter. Instead, we would let Donald proceed under the delusion that his path was completely clear. The following morning, I returned to the office wearing a simple dark gray suit. I took a seat in a small, windowless interior conference room on the 7th floor, opened my laptop, and began creating a private offline dossier titled Merger Compliance Audit. Although Donald had cut off my administrative access to live server systems, he could not erase my 12 years of institutional knowledge. I knew every contract renewal date, every carrier tariff rate, and every vendor indemnity exception by heart. Over the next several days, I quietly attended every open integration meeting, sitting in the very back row of the auditorium with my notebook open. Nobody asked me to participate, but nobody explicitly barred me from sitting in public sessions either. Donald and Trevor were far too busy congratulating themselves in front of visiting Vanguard executives to pay attention to the middle-aged man sitting silently near the exit doors. Trevor stood at the front of the room, clicking through a glossy presentation deck titled Post-Merger Operational Synergies. "We will immediately sunset Ardent's legacy logistics tracking software," Trevor announced proudly, "and migrate all platform operations to Vanguard's proprietary enterprise system within 30 days of closing. The transition will be completely seamless." I knew for a fact that Vanguard's proprietary tracking platform was an unstable legacy software system built 9 years ago that suffered frequent outage spikes during peak holiday shipping volumes. But I said nothing. I simply wrote down the timestamp, logged the statement in my notebook, and waited. During a break in the presentation, I approached Trevor near the refreshment bowl and asked a quiet, polite question. "Trevor, have our legal counselors confirmed that Vanguard's system complies with our existing customer service level agreements regarding freight tracking indemnification?" Trevor chuckled condescendingly, taking a sip of sparkling water. "Mitchell, leave the high-level legal architecture to the executive team. Your job right now is just to keep your head down and enjoy the transition. Everything is fully under control." I smiled calmly, nodded, and noted his exact response in my dossier. They thought I was a harmless relic of the past. They had no idea I was documenting every single breach of fiduciary duty they committed. By the middle of the following week, the atmosphere inside Ardent Systems had reached a fever pitch. Banners celebrating the upcoming merger were hung across the main lobby, and sleek silver gift boxes containing branded Vanguard Logistics merchandise were distributed to senior staff. Yet behind the glossy public relations facade, Donald Blake's executive team was quietly accelerating their efforts to eliminate potential loose ends. On Thursday morning, my electronic keycard suddenly failed at the executive elevator bank. When I swiped it against the reader, a sharp red light flashed and the display read, "Restricted access. Level 2 only." Level 2 was where employee records, physical storage archives, and human resources were situated. A young security guard standing near the turnstiles gave me an apologetic glance. "I am sorry, Mr. Carver," he said quietly. "Management updated the security permissions this morning. Special project staff are restricted to the lower administration floors unless escorted by an executive officer." I did not argue or make a scene. I simply nodded, turned around, and took the carpeted stairs down to level 2. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, while I was reviewing archived contract records in a quiet corner of the lower library, Lena Walsh entered the room. Lena was a 26-year-old executive assistant who worked directly outside Donald Blake's main office suite. She was exceptionally bright, highly detail-oriented, and had always appreciated the respectful way I treated administrative staff. She glanced nervously around the empty room before stepping over to my table, holding a folder against her chest. "Mr. Carver," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You need to know what Donald and Trevor are doing upstairs. They held a closed-door meeting with external employment counsel 2 hours ago." "What kind of meeting, Lena?" I asked calmly. "They are fast-tracking a forced severance agreement for you," she said, leaning closer. "Donald wants your employment officially terminated before the final board vote next Thursday. He told legal to prepare a standard exit package with a strict non-disparagement clause and a complete waiver of all equity claims. And if I refuse to sign it?" Lena swallowed hard. "Trevor suggested drafting a retroactive performance warning, claiming you failed to fulfill your assigned special projects duties. They are trying to create a paper trail of cause so they can threaten to revoke your severance entirely if you resist." I looked at Lena for a long moment, seeing the genuine concern in her eyes. "Thank you for telling me, Lena. Please make sure you stay completely clear of this. I do not want your job put at risk." She nodded quickly, handed me a copy of an internal email distribution list showing the pending termination timeline, and hurried out of the library. That evening, I met Frank Callahan at a quiet diner 3 blocks from his legal practice. I laid Lena's document on the table next to our growing stack of evidence. "They are trying to execute a forced squeeze-out," Frank observed after scanning the email thread. "Donald knows the merger closing date is approaching, and he is trying to clean up the corporate registry before Vanguard's legal auditors conduct their final pre-closing title search. Can they force a termination for cause without board authorization?" I asked. "Not legally under your co-founder executive contract," Frank answered firmly. "But more importantly, even if they fired you today, your active voting equity under Section 8.3 remains legally intact. Employment termination does not extinguish voting rights attached to founding charter equity, unless the charter explicitly provides for mandatory redemption. And your charter contains zero redemption language." Frank opened his briefcase and pulled out 2 formal documents bound in navy blue covers. "This is a formal notice of rights and demand for governance compliance," Frank explained. "It outlines your explicit status as an original voting equity holder under Section 8.3 and explicitly notifies the board that any change of control transaction executed without your written consent constitutes a material breach of charter, corporate fraud, and an uncurable defect in title." "Do we serve it now?" I asked. "Not yet," Frank replied with a tactical grin. "We serve it in the boardroom during the final ratification vote on Thursday morning. We let Donald Blake complete his entire presentation to Vanguard C-suite. We let him declare to the room that all corporate approvals are unanimous and absolute. And right when he lifts his pen to sign the master transaction agreement, we deliver the notice in front of every buyer, board member, and investor in the building." Over the next 3 days, I conducted a deep forensic review of the financial annexes Lena had managed to pull from the executive print queue. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Donald Blake and Trevor Higgins had secretly negotiated massive side deals that were completely hidden from general shareholders and lower-level staff. Donald had structured a personal consultation continuity fee of $200,000 payable immediately upon deal closure, alongside a discretionary bonus package. Trevor had secured a backdated stock option grant that allocated him $300,000 in equity at the expense of our general employee stock pool. Meanwhile, long-term operational employees were slated for immediate layoffs within 90 days of acquisition with zero severance protection. Donald and Trevor were not just selling the company. They were gutting its foundation, lining their own pockets, and leaving the people who actually built the business with nothing. My resolve hardened into solid steel. This was no longer just about protecting my legal rights as a co-founder. It was about holding arrogant corporate raiders accountable for their greed. On Wednesday afternoon, a formal meeting invitation arrived in my email inbox from Donald Blake's office. Subject: Final merger ratification meeting, optional attendance. Mitchell, you are cordially invited to attend the final merger execution ceremony in Executive Boardroom A on Thursday at 10 o'clock morning. While your presence is entirely optional, attendance by all legacy personnel will help demonstrate organizational unity to our incoming partners from Vanguard Logistics. I clicked the accept button without hesitation. I would be there at 10 o'clock, and I would make sure the optics were unforgettable. Thursday morning arrived under a clear, cold sky. Executive Boardroom A on the ninth floor had been transformed into a lavish showcase. Long arrangements of white orchids lined the center of the 30-foot mahogany table, crystal water carafes glinted under soft recessed lighting, and silver trays of imported pastries sat untouched near the window. Two corporate photographers, hired by our public relations department, moved quietly around the perimeter, setting up lighting gear to capture the historical moment when Ardent Systems officially merged into Vanguard Logistics for $250 million. High-ranking executives from Vanguard Logistics sat on the left side of the table, dressed in impeccable dark suits. Among them was Paul Vance, Vanguard's chief operating officer, a tall, sharp-eyed man known throughout the industry for his uncompromising due diligence. On the right side sat Ardent's board of directors, including board chair Harrison Cole, a gray-haired veteran investor who had supported our company since series. A Donald Blake stood at the head of the table, wearing a bespoke Navy suit and a broad, triumphant smile. Trevor Higgins sat immediately to his right, nervously adjusting his silk tie and shuffling a stack of signature pages. I entered the room at 9:55, wearing my simple dark suit, carrying a leather notepad. I did not take a seat at the main table. Instead, I quietly sat in one of the auxiliary leather chairs positioned along the back wall, right next to a potted ficus plant. Trevor glanced over at me and offered a brief, condescending nod. "Glad you could make it to witness history, Mitchell," he whispered as he walked past. "Just sit back, enjoy the moment, and try not to look too gloomy for the press photos." I gave him a silent, placid smile and kept my hands folded over my notepad. At precisely 10 o'clock, Donald Blake cleared his throat loudly and tapped his gold pen against his water glass, bringing the room to instant order. "Gentlemen and ladies," Donald began, his voice booming with confidence, "today marks the culmination of months of intense negotiation, strategic vision, and relentless execution. We are uniting two powerhouse logistics entities into a global leader under a $250 million transaction framework." Harrison Cole nodded approvingly. From the center of the board table, Donald clicked to his final slide, displaying a large graphic of two interlocking corporate logos. "Our legal counsel, Gail Morton, has confirmed that all preliminary corporate governance requirements, board resolutions, and shareholder disclosures have been executed with complete precision." Donald continued, flashing his white teeth toward Paul Vance. "We have achieved absolute, unanimous alignment across every tier of leadership. There are zero remaining obstacles." Paul Vance offered a cautious smile. "Excellent. Vanguard's board has authorized me to execute the master agreement today, provided all founding charter requirements and governance title representations are fully satisfied." "They are 100% satisfied," Donald declared boldly, picking up his heavy fountain pen and opening the leather-bound master contract. "Let us sign the agreement and make history." Donald lowered his pen toward the signature line. At that exact second, the heavy double doors of Boardroom A swung open with a firm, deliberate push. Frank Callahan walked into the boardroom, carrying a dark leather briefcase in one hand and a thin navy blue binder in the other. He moved forward with absolute calm authority, ignoring the startled glances from board members and security personnel. "Pardon the brief interruption," Frank announced, his clear, resonant voice instantly cutting through the quiet room. "Before any signatures are affixed to that master agreement, we must review a mandatory governance requirement under Ardent Systems' foundational corporate charter." Donald's pen stopped less than an inch above the paper. His face darkened instantly with fury. "What is the meaning of this?" Donald barked, slamming his hand on the table. "Who let you in here? Security! Remove this man immediately!" Harrison Cole raised a hand, frowning deeply. "Wait a moment. Donald, who are you, sir?" "My name is Frank Callahan," Frank replied calmly, placing his navy blue binder squarely on the center of the mahogany table. "I am lead legal counsel representing Mitchell Carver, co-founder, active voting equity holder, and original signatory to Ardent Systems' foundational corporate charter." A sudden, uncomfortable hush fell over the room. Paul Vance leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing instantly. Frank opened the binder, revealing an old yellow document bearing original blue ink signatures and a raised corporate seal. Under Section 8.3 of Ardent Systems' foundational charter, Frank read aloud in a slow, deliberate voice, "Any material change of control event, including but not limited to mergers, asset sales, or majority equity restructurings, requires the unanimous affirmative written consent of all original signatories holding active voting shares at the time of decision." Donald let out a harsh, nervous laugh. "That is complete nonsense. That early charter clause was superseded during our 2017 equity restructuring. Mitchell Carver holds a harmless 1% legacy stake that possesses zero voting authority." Frank looked directly at Gail Morton, Ardent's head of corporate legal counsels. "Is that your official legal opinion, Ms. Morton?" Frank asked quietly. "Because under Delaware General Corporation law, a unanimous consent veto clause embedded in an original charter cannot be amended or superseded without an explicit executed written waiver from every affected voting signatory." Gail Morton's face drained of all color. She quickly pulled open her own legal reference binder, her hands trembling noticeably as she scanned the foundational corporate registry. She spent 30 agonizing seconds reading the original charter filings before looking up at Donald with an expression of sheer horror. "Donald," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "Mr. Callahan is correct. The 2017 restructuring amended stock distribution tiers, but Section 8.3 was never formally waived or reclassified. Mitchell Carver's active voting rights remain fully intact under state law." The boardroom erupted into chaos. Paul Vance stood up so quickly his heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "What did you just say?" Vance demanded, staring fiercely at Donald Blake. "Are you telling me that Vanguard is about to sign a $250 million acquisition contract with an uncleared corporate title defect and an unwaived founding veto clause?" "No, no. Please, Paul, listen to me." Donald stuttered, sweat suddenly glistening across his forehead as his slick composure completely collapsed. "This is just a minor administrative oversight, a tiny technicality. Mitchell Carver is a junior special projects advisor. He does not even have an active operational team." "He does not need an operational team, Donald." Frank Callahan interjected smoothly. "He holds active voting equity, locked into Section 8.3 of the charter you failed to read. Without his explicit written consent, any merger contract you sign today is legally void, unenforceable, and constitutes intentional misrepresentation to your buyers." Harrison Cole turned on Donald with fury in his eyes. "You assured this board 3 weeks ago that all founding equity disclosures were fully vetted and cleared." Donald ignored the board chair and spun around toward the back of the room, looking directly at me for the first time all morning. His chest was heaving, his eyes wide with desperate panic. "Mitchell," Donald pleaded, his voice cracking slightly, "let us be reasonable here. We can fix this right now. I will personally draft an executive amendment restoring your title as Senior Vice President of Operations. We will allocate you an extra $50,000 in post-merger retention bonuses. Just come up to the table, execute the charter waiver, and let us finish this deal." Trevor Higgins rushed over to my chair, his face pale and contorted with desperation. "Please, Mitchell," Trevor begged, clutching his hands together. "Think about the company. Think about our future. Do not ruin this for everyone over a minor misunderstanding." I stood up slowly from my chair near the potted ficus. The entire room went dead silent. 20 pairs of eyes followed my every move as I walked down the center of the boardroom to the head of the table. I stopped right beside Donald Blake, looking down at the multi-million-dollar master merger contract resting on the polished wood. "This was never a misunderstanding, Donald," I said in a calm, measured tone that carried to every corner of the room. "You looked at my 12 years of sweat equity, my operational groundwork, and my 1% voting stake, and you called it a cute startup souvenir. You stripped my access, isolated my role, and tried to quietly push me out the door with a fabricated termination package so you could pocket secret side bonuses and abandon our long-term staff." "That is not true," Donald gasped out, grabbing the edge of the table to steady his trembling hands. I pulled out my leather notepad, opened it to my detailed audit log, and laid it right beside his contract. In this notebook, I recorded every refusal of information, every false representation made to Vanguard Logistics, and every secret executive payout scheduled. Under your proposed transaction, I stated clearly, looking Paul Vance directly in the eye. Page 4 details $200,000 in undisclosed consulting fees allocated to Donald Blake. Page 7 details backdated stock options for Trevor Higgins, while operational staff face immediate layoffs. Paul Vance's face turned to ice. He looked at Donald with utter contempt. Due diligence is officially terminated, Vance announced in a cold, rigid voice. Vanguard Logistics will not participate in a transaction infected by governance fraud and uncleared title liabilities. We are withdrawing our offer immediately, Vance signaled to his executive team, gathered his briefcase, and walked straight out of the boardroom without looking back. The entire Vanguard delegation followed him in a silent, swift parade, leaving the double doors wide open behind them. $250 million in corporate valuation vanished into thin air in less than 60 seconds. Donald Blake slumped into his chair like a man who had just been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Trevor sank against the wall, covering his face with both hands. Harrison Cole stood up, his face dark with outrage, as he looked down at Donald. Boardroom meeting adjourned, Cole declared coldly. Donald Blake, you are suspended from all executive duties effective immediately pending a full forensic audit of your fiduciary conduct. I picked up the master merger signature packet resting on the table. I uncapped my black pen, turned to the final page requiring original signatory consent under Section 8.3, and wrote a single word across the approval line in large, bold script. DAT. I handed the document to Gail Morton, who took it with trembling hands. Then I closed my leather notebook, adjusted my jacket, and looked at Donald Blake one last time. Your $250 million merger is officially dead, Donald, I said softly. But do not worry. Special projects is where all the real magic happens. I turned around and walked out of the boardroom into the bright morning light, leaving the shattered executives to count the true cost of the 1% they had tried so hard to ignore.